So let's dive into the Dockerfile, which is actually a recipe for creating your image. And so far, all of the Docker images we've been using were created from Docker files, where you can go look at them on Docker Hub. So if you've cloned my repository from the resources listed in the first section, you should see a Docker sample file 1 directory. And in there, we should have just one file, a Docker file. So we're going to go line by line and talk about these different stanzas. A Docker file seems to look like a shell script, but it's not. It's not a batch file, it's not a shell script, it's a totally different language of file that's unique to Docker. And the default name is Dockerfile with a capital D. But from the command line, whenever you need to deal with a Docker file using the Docker command, you can actually use the -f, which is actually common amongst a lot of the tools with Docker. You can use -f to specify a different file than the default. So first up is the from command. And the from command is in every Docker file. It's required to be there. It's normally a minimal distribution. In this case, it's Debian, but a lot of times nowadays it's going to be Alpine. And really the reason you would use these is to save yourself time and pain, because these minimal distributions are actually much smaller than the CDs you would use to install a virtual machine from them. So for example, like the Ubuntu one doesn't even have curl in it. Whereas obviously if you installed a full Ubuntu installation on a VM, it would have curl and a lot of other commands already installed. So because all of these distributions are official images, it means that they're going to be always up to date with the latest security patches, and you can depend and trust on them. And one of the main benefits for using them in containers is to use their package distribution systems to install whatever software you need in your package. So in this case, we're actually using the Jessie release, which is what's after the colon. And as you remember from our Docker Hub conversation, there's lots of different options you can specify here for the Debian repository. So next we have the env stanza. And env is for environment variables. It's a way to set environment variables, which are actually very important in containers because they're the main way we set keys and values for container building and for running containers. So in this case, it's actually setting the version of Nginx it would like us to install. And this environment variable will be set so that any subsequent lines will be able to use it. Now, as a reminder from previous lectures, each one of these stanzas is an actual layer in our Docker image. So the order of them actually matters because it does work top down. And as you'll see by this relatively long run command here for the next one, you see that it looks like one long command. And what it's doing is really just executing shell commands inside this container as it's building it. So you'll usually see run commands when you need to install software with a package repository, or you need to do some unzipping or some file edits inside the container itself. Run commands can also run shell scripts that you've copied in earlier in the file, or any commands that you can access from inside the container at that point in time in the file. So since we're coming from Debian, this run command has access to all the commands and binaries that would have been installed with that release. And in this one for Nginx, this list of commands is more or less adding a key to the repository where you can get the package to install the latest Nginx from the official Nginx repository. So there's a few things here that are really key in making good Docker files. And we'll actually talk about this more in a later section when we talk about best practices. But two things to note. The reason that we're adding all these commands with the double ampersand here so that they're chained one after the other is because if you remember, each stanza is its own layer. So what this does is ensures that all of these commands are fit into one single layer. It saves us a little time, it saves us space, and it's so common that you'll probably see it in every Docker file on Docker Hub. Okay, on line 27, we've got another run command. This one is all about pointing our log files to the stdout and stderr. So we'll see later the proper way to do logging inside a container is to not log to a log file. And there's no syslogd or any other syslog service inside a container. Docker actually handles all of our logging for us. All we have to do inside the container is make sure that everything we want to be captured in the logs is spit to stdout and stderr. And Docker will handle the rest. There's actually logging drivers that we can use in the Docker engine itself to control all the logs for all the containers on our host And so that's really what you want to do with them. It adds more complexity to your app if your app is actually doing the logging itself. And then if you have to deal with files in every container, now you've got a problem of how do you get those files out and searchable and accessible. So here we're taking the default Nginx logs and we're actually linking them to the std out so that Docker can capture them. We also have an expose command. So by default, no TCP or UDP ports are open inside a container. It doesn't expose anything from the container to a virtual network unless we list it here. And of course, because this is a web and proxy server, it's going to expose 80 and 443. Now, this expose command does not mean these ports are going to be opened automatically on our host. That's what the -p command is whenever we use Docker run. And lastly, we have the CMD here. The CMD is a required parameter that is the final command that will be run every time you launch a new container from the image or every time you restart a stopped container. And there's some really excellent documentation on all of these stanzas, plus a whole lot more that we're going to go into later on the Docker's documentation website at docs.docker.com, which you can find in the resources of this lecture. Okay, so then these are the basics, right? These 5 different stanzas are pretty normal in every single Docker file. Some of them are required, some of them like the run and the env and the expose are optional, but they're pretty typical for most containers that you're going to create images for. So what do we do with this file? Well, let's exit out, and we're going to see in this directory that we just have this one file. It's barely a K in size. It's obviously doesn't have anything in it other than the text, but it's the instructions on how to build our image. So the from command, when I build this image, is going to actually pull that Debian Jessie image from Docker Hub down to my local cache, and then it's going to execute line by line each of those stanzas inside my Docker engine and cache each of those layers. So let's type Docker image build, and we're going to tag it. Remember, that's the name that we're going to give an image. And since I'm going to only use this image locally, I don't have to use my Docker Hub account name. I can call it whatever I want. So I'm going to call it custom Nginx, and I'm going to put a dot here, which basically says build the Docker file in this directory. And you'll see as it steps through this that each step is a line in the Docker file that it's executing inside this image as it's building it. And then there's a little hash at the end, which is actually the hash it keeps in the build cache so that next time we build this thing, if that line hasn't changed in the Docker file, it's not going to rerun it. And this is one of the magic pieces of why Docker makes deployment and software building so fast, is it actually is intelligent enough to cache the steps in the build. So quite often after you've built an image the first time and you're really just there changing your custom source code and not necessarily changing the application in it itself, all this installation stuff has already happened. So you will have very short build times. Okay, so now we're done building. That took about a minute. But what if I go back in that file? I'm going to add an additional exposed port. And for example, I'm just going to do 8080. Now that doesn't mean that Nginx is smart enough to know that I'm opening this port or that it's in any way communicating with Nginx. It's just me allowing the container to receive packets on that port. Now just to be sure, let's do a Docker image ls, and we'll see right up at the top that it auto tagged it as latest, right? Because we only called it the repository name. We didn't actually give it a colon tag name when we tagged it. So let's build it again. So wow, that was fast, right? That only took us a couple of seconds. And you'll notice that on each step, it'll say using cache. Starting with step 2, it'll say using cache on 3, using cache on 4. On 5, it recognizes on step 5 that that line is different. So it actually executes that into the container. And then on step 6, it has to rerun that line because the minute a line changes, every line after that now has to be rebuilt as well. And so this brings up the point about the ordering of your lines in your Docker file. Because if you get things out of order, for instance, if you copy the code in, let's say you're building a website, if you're copying the software code that you're creating at the very beginning of the file, then every time you change a source file and you rebuild, it's going to have to build the entire Docker file again. So it's critically important for your sanity and time that you usually keep the things at the top of your Dockerfile that change the least, and then the things that change the most at the bottom of your Dockerfile. All right, let's look at some more Dockerfile examples. So in our repository that you've downloaded from my GitHub, let's go into Dockerfile sample number 2. And this time we actually have 2 files. We have the Dockerfile, and now we have an index.html. Super simple, hello world HTML. It's not really important to understand the HTML. We're just going to copy it into our container image as we're building it. So if we look at the Dockerfile, we'll see on this one that we're actually using nginx as our from command. So we're not building our own nginx, because ideally, if you can use an official image to get the job done from Docker Hub, then it'll be a lot easier for you to maintain this Dockerfile and keep it working well. So in simpler scenarios, quite often the official images work, but as you grow and add complexity to your environment and your systems, you'll probably find that you need to add additional custom software or change the way that it starts or add scripts in so that it tweaks the configuration. But when I'm starting a new greenfield project, or if I'm converting some old app, I always start with the official images from Docker Hub. And then once I hit some roadblocks and I'm not able to use that image anymore, I might go back to Docker Hub and take another look and see if there's anything custom out there that's really popular that I can trust and look into and see if it's going to solve my problem. But there's nothing wrong with building your own. It's just more work and more upkeep over time. So here it's super simple. We've got 3 stanzas. You've seen the from before. And this time we have the work dir. Now that's really just basically running a cd space directory change. And so you might be tempted to use the run command and just type run cd to this directory and then do some things. But really the best practice for Docker files is to always use a separate work dir stanza for whenever you're changing directories. So if your file gets a little complex and you have to move back and forth in your container to do things while it's building, you always want to use the work dir because it's a lot easier to describe in the Docker file what you're doing. So in this case, what we're actually doing here is we're changing to the default nginx directory for its HTML files. So in the default configuration on Docker Hub, nginx is acting just as a web server, and it's just serving static files right off the container disk. And the last stanza here we have is the copy. And this is the stanza you'll always be using to copy your source code from your local machine or your build servers into your container images. And in this case, we're just taking our simple index.html and we're overwriting the file in the nginx default directory so that it's our custom homepage for the web server. And before we build this, you'll notice that we're missing required stanzas like the CMD. So how can we get away with that? Well, there's already a CMD specified in the from image. And when we use the from, we inherit everything from the Docker file we're froming, if that's even a word. So this is how you can chain Docker files together so that images depend on other images depend on other images. All right, let's see how this works. So before we build this, let's just quickly remind ourselves what a default nginx server does. Let's do a quick docker container run -p 8080. And we're not going to need this very long, so we're going to do a --rm so it will delete on quitting. And we don't care about the name, we're just going to run nginx. And if we hop over to our browser and just type in localhost, we see the default nginx index page. Okay, so let's remember that, and then let's just quit this container, and we're going to now build our version of nginx with our extra source code file. Okay, and this one should actually go really quick. You notice that it only took a few seconds, and that's because we already had nginx in our image cache, and all it was running was copying a very small file and changing the working directory. So now let's run the exact command we just ran for nginx, only this time we're going to use this new image we just built. Switch over to our browser and refresh, and great, our custom index HTML is running in there and our container works. And if we do a quick image ls, we can see our latest image up there at the top. And if we actually wanted to send this up to Docker Hub, it works the same way as we did earlier. We just need to re-tag it. So we could do docker image tag. And if you remember the help command, we can look at the format. And it's always the one we're tagging and the tag that we want it to then be called. So Docker image tag nginx with HTML latest, and then I'll have to call it Brett Fisher like that. And then if I do a Docker image ls again, you'll see those top two lines are the same image ID again and just tagged differently. So now I could do a Docker push with that repository and tag, and I could get it up on Docker Hub.